So admittedly, I've never played a Warhammer game before. Well, a mainline one, that is. I did play through this game's sequel, Bolt Gun, a couple months back and thought it was great, but that game is more of a spin-off. I've also been keeping up with the coverage for Space Marine 2, which looks amazing. Anyway, I figured what better time to go back and check out this one, given it's supposed to be a pretty good entry point into the series, and I've heard great things about it. Real quick, I want to mention this game's pricing on PC. If you decide to pick this one up, don't buy this game on Steam. The suits at Sega jacked this game's pricing all the way up to $60, presumably to take advantage of all those Space Marine 2 wishlists. Just go to a key site and get it for $10 instead, or wait for a sale. Alright, let's talk about the technical stuff first. Technically, Space Marine is very polished for the most part. I never encountered any major bugs or crashes throughout my entire playthrough. It's not perfect though. You rely on your allies to progress a lot in this game, and they get stuck on random geometry pretty often, which just requires a love tap to fix. As for the PC port, it's very good, and definitely the best place to experience this game, given it was never brought forward to current consoles. This is a fairly old game now, so it's pretty easy for any relatively modern PC to run this maxed out, but there is a nice settings menu in case you need to change some things. Now let's go over the visuals. Visually, Space Marine looks good, not great. The art style definitely does a lot of the heavy lifting in this department. It's a great depiction of the 40K universe from the characters, weapons, and setting. It's a very stylized game, which does help it stand out a good bit from all the other military-esque shooters from this time. Unfortunately, the novelty does wear off pretty quick, and does start to get pretty boring to look at. This is one of those games where pretty much every location looks the same, and it's very easy for you to confuse where you are versus where you've been. One thing I do want to give this game credit for, though, is its sense of scale. The levels in this game are a lot bigger and more open than you would probably expect from a game this old. You often get these lookout points that oversee a massive vista, and they all look great. There's also a lot of moving environmental objects in this game. These might seem like small details, but seeing some of these, especially the huge ones later on, really add a lot to the atmosphere. Real quick, I'll mention the audio. It's good, but nothing remarkable. Weapons all have very good sound effects that match their look, and the same goes for the enemies. Now what I do want to point out is the music. It's excellent, and really improves this game's presentation. This game is obviously focused on war, so they needed a soundtrack to match that. Although this isn't the kind of dark, gritty soundtrack that you would find in a World War II movie or something, for example. Instead, it's this epic orchestral score that gets you excited as you run into the next fight and take on dozens of enemies at once. So overall, when it comes to the presentation, the visuals get the job done, but do get old pretty fast, and the soundtrack is fantastic. Let's move on to the story. Space Marine's narrative revolves around, you guessed it, a Space Marine. Specifically one named Captain Titus, the character that you'll be playing as. There's also a handful of other characters ranging from your fellow Ultramarines Sidonis and Leandros, as well as other important figures like Inquisitor Drogon and Miranda Nero. The game is set in a place called Forge World Graia, which has been invaded by the game's main enemy type, orcs. Alright, I know that was a lot of information all at once, but I promise all of that will make sense soon. Let me explain what some of that stuff actually means. An Ultramarine is a cybernetically enhanced super soldier and one of the most feared/respected things in the 40K universe. These guys were designed for war, and that's what Space Marine is all about. Now like I mentioned earlier, the main threat in this game is the orcs, which are these green alien enemies. They are here in an attempt to steal some of the planet's powerful weapons and its technology. As an Ultramarine, it is now your job to defend the planet and its people against the orcs. You'll do this by completing key objectives in the fight, like taking back a captured defense cannon, defeating the enemy leader, and of course, killing literally thousands of orcs along the way. There's actually quite a lot of cutscenes here, usually for showing off the insane capabilities of the Ultramarines, or to progress the narrative with your next objective. You can also uncover more of the narrative through these things called servo skulls, which, fancy wording aside, are the audio logs that give you lore. These are interesting enough if you're actually into the 40K universe, but these probably won't do much for you if this is your first entry into this world. Credit where credit is due though, it's nice that you can listen to these without pausing the gameplay. So, like I said earlier, I am not a 40K guy, and thus I can't judge this game on its depiction of the universe and setting. What I can do is tell you about what I think of this game's story from the perspective of someone that knew jack about this world before getting into this game. Right off the bat, I will tell you right now that you do not need to know anything about 40K and its world to get into this game and enjoy it. All you need to know is that the big marines wearing several hundred pounds of armor are the good guys, and the little green guys are the enemy. Everything beyond that is essentially a bonus. Space Marine's goal is to put you in the shoes of a frontline soldier in the middle of a war, and let you go from there. That is why Space Marine is widely considered to be such a good entry point into the 40K universe. I personally ended up quite enjoying the story by the end thanks to its fun characters and some unexpected plot twists. But if you don't care about anything beyond just mowing down scores of aliens like in Master Chief's dreams, I can still recommend Space Marine to you thanks to its gameplay, which I'll talk about now. So like I mentioned earlier, Space Marine is all about putting you in the shoes of a soldier in the middle of a war, and the gameplay reflects that very well. The combat is pretty straightforward and easy to learn. So much so, in fact, that there's no dedicated tutorial sequence in this game where you're locked in a small room with some guy that tells you how to do everything. No, instead you're just thrown straight into the heat of battle and need to learn everything on your own. There are these on-screen messages that tell you how to do certain things, but this game is so fast-paced and requires your full attention, so you'll probably just ignore most of these. Anyway, there's two ways that you'll be engaging the enemies: ranged and melee. Ranged is of course the safer option, given that you can stand back from your enemies and just shoot at them behind cover. You can only have 4 ranged weapons equipped at once, but you can change them out very often, usually before large fights. All the weapons in this game feel great to use, and it's always exciting when you find a new one and immediately start looking for the nearest orc to use it on. And then there's the melee combat, which is by far my favorite method to attack in this game. The controls for this feel pretty clunky at first, because you aren't used to how each weapon forces you to move, but when you get used to it, it's incredibly satisfying. You can only have 1 melee weapon equipped at a time, and there's not as many to choose from as the ranged weapons. You'll start out with just a basic combat knife, but you'll soon unlock the chainsword, the power axe, and my personal favorite, the thunder hammer. The thunder hammer actually limits you to only carrying 2 ranged weapons instead of 4, but I almost always found the trade-off to be worth it. I mean, just look at this thing. Finally, you've also got grenades, which are good for clearing out large hordes of enemies at a distance. In general, the best way to be effective in this game that I've found is to shoot at your enemies as you're running towards them, and then finish them off with melee. The combat is also changed up occasionally with this jetpack you can use, which allows you to fly up into the air and then quickly slam into a bunch of enemies, which is just awesome. One thing I also want to highlight is the way that you heal in this game. You see, you're an ultramarine. You don't have time to stop shooting at things and pull out your medkit or something like that. Instead, the way that you recover your health is by stunning an enemy with this bash attack, and then performing an incredibly awesome to watch execution on them. Doom Guy would be proud. One thing I dislike though is that you also have a shield system very similar to Halo, which can only be recharged by avoiding damage for a certain period of time. I understand why they have this system in place, because losing health every time you took damage would probably require a serious rework to the entire combat model to make it feel balanced. But this just feels dated, and really slows down the gameplay, so I think it would have been best to find an alternative to this. Now you would think that this combat would get repetitive after a while, but this game's relatively short runtime of about 7 hours ensures that it remains engaging all the way through. Unfortunately, the combat is not without its faults. By far my largest complaint with this game is its enemy roster. In general, there simply aren't many orc types to fight outside of the basic fodder and elite types. There's also this other enemy group that gets introduced around the halfway point, and some of these really suck. There's these ones that engage you at range, and they just absolutely melt your health in a matter of seconds, which feels incredibly cheap. Outside of that though, the difficulty of Space Marine feels very fair and fine-tuned, at least on normal. I also would have liked to see a few more boss fights, as there's only one real one, and then another one done through QuickTime events. Aside from those few things, Space Marine is a very enjoyable game from start to finish, and one of the best executions of a power fantasy you will find. So obviously I'm recommending this to you. Whether you're a Warhammer nerd that somehow missed out on this one, or whether this is your first exposure to the universe, Space Marine is a great game that I think pretty much any fan of action games will enjoy. I want to end this video with some things that I'm hoping to see in this game's sequel sometime next year. I want them to keep this game's approach to storytelling, where it's just as approachable for newcomers as it is for Warhammer veterans. As far as combat goes, I want them to keep the balance of melee and ranged engagement, but in an expanded way. More weapon types, more enemies to kill, more gruesome executions, more everything. Graphics are where I'm personally hoping for the largest improvements. I want to see some real location variety between the different levels you progress through with some more standout environments. It's very straightforward really. I want more of this with better visuals and even more epic combat, and from what I've seen of Space Marine 2 so far, that's exactly what we're getting, and I'm very excited to check it out whenever that releases. Thank you for watching, and have a good one.